The evening was one of those nights the city talked about for weeks in advance. Every major business magazine, every financial blog, and every invitation-only social circle had mentioned the grand corporate gala at least once. It was the kind of event where people dressed not only to impress but also to communicate their status without speaking a word. Luxury cars lined the long driveway of the Crystal Hall, each one shining under the soft golden lights placed carefully along the entrance. The staff moved around gracefully, greeting guests with the kind of warm professionalism that made even the wealthiest people feel special. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was even more breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above like stars, and a delicate mix of soft music and gentle conversation filled the air. The tables were arranged in perfect symmetry, each decorated with fresh white roses and silver details. It was a night designed to show elegance, success, and power. But among the hundreds of guests walking in, one man drew quiet attention without even trying: Daniel Carter. Daniel had built his reputation over the years, not through inherited wealth or family connections but through hard work, innovation, and a calm, thoughtful personality that made even the busiest people pause and listen. He was the founder and CEO of Carter Dynamics, a tech company that had changed the way businesses moved goods across the world. Many people in the room admired him, not because of his expensive suit or watch. His choices were simple and classic, but because of the calm confidence in the way he carried himself. As he stepped into the hall, several guests came forward to shake his hand. Some praised his latest invention. Others asked for advice. A few simply smiled, grateful for the chance to speak to someone whose name often appeared in the headlines. Daniel accepted every greeting with quiet humility. He never rushed anyone, and he never acted as though he was above them. If anything, he made others feel comfortable, which was rare in a room full of people who constantly measured their value by wealth and influence. Not far from the entrance, the event organizers observed Daniel with quiet satisfaction. They knew having him at the gala raised the event's prestige. They also knew that tonight's most important business conversation would revolve around the possible partnership between Carter Dynamics and the Langford Group, a real estate empire led by billionaire Richard Langford. Richard was known for his bold investments and his ability to transform failing projects into profitable ones. His presence at any event usually pulled attention, especially because he often arrived with his wife, Victoria Langford, a woman whose style and confidence made her one of the most photographed social personalities in the city. She loved being seen, loved being admired, and she rarely entered a room without making sure all eyes were on her. But tonight, Richard and Victoria were running late. Their delayed arrival created a quiet sense of curiosity among some guests. "They're never this late," one businesswoman commented as she sipped her drink. "Something must have held them up." Another laughed softly. "Maybe they wanted to make an entrance. You know Victoria, she enjoys the spotlight." Meanwhile, Daniel stood near a table with two members of his team, discussing the upcoming project that both companies were supposed to finalize soon. His voice remained calm, but he listened closely, showing his usual attention to detail. It wasn't just business for him. He took pride in creating things that could genuinely help industries grow. As more people arrived, the excitement inside the hall grew stronger. Everyone knew how important the night was. A billion-dollar joint venture was not something that happened every day, and many investors had flown in from different countries just to witness the opening celebration. The partnership between Carter Dynamics and the Langford Group had the potential to change entire sectors of transportation and development. Even guests who were not involved directly wanted to stay close to the conversation, hoping to understand what the future might look like. Suddenly, the soft sound of a camera clicking grew louder. A familiar flash of light appeared near the entrance. A few guests turned, and the whisper traveled quickly across the hall. "They're here." Richard Langford stepped inside, dressed in a classic black suit, tailored to perfection. His posture was confident, but he looked slightly tired, as if the day had been longer than expected. Walking beside him was Victoria, wearing a stunning red gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her smile was bright, her hair perfectly styled, and she had the kind of walk that made photographers raise their cameras automatically. She scanned the hall with the ease of someone who believed every room belonged to her. When she noticed people watching, she smiled even more, giving small nods of acknowledgement. She enjoyed attention. It made her feel powerful, admired, and untouchable. Richard, on the other hand, was focused on the business at hand. He didn't care about the cameras or the whispers. He was thinking about the deal, the presentations, and the discussions that were supposed to happen later in the night. The future of his company depended heavily on securing the partnership with Daniel's team. His real estate empire had grown quickly, but rapid growth came with huge financial pressure. The joint venture with Carter Dynamics was supposed to stabilize the company's long-term outlook. While Richard and Victoria began greeting guests near the entrance, Daniel continued speaking with an international investor who had approached him. The conversation was simple, thoughtful, and friendly, just the way Daniel liked to interact with people. He didn't try to impress anyone. He simply shared ideas and listened to the ones offered back. Across the room, Victoria noticed something that made her pause. The small crowd around Daniel seemed unusually cheerful. People were smiling, leaning in to hear him, and showing signs of genuine admiration. At first, she didn't think much of it, but when she noticed how many eyes in the room were drifting toward Daniel instead of toward her and Richard, a small flicker of irritation sparked inside her. She whispered softly to her husband, "Who is that everyone keeps looking at?" Richard glanced toward Daniel, then replied, "That's Daniel Carter, the CEO I told you about. His company is the one we're planning to work with." Victoria kept her eyes on Daniel for a moment longer. She watched how people listened to him with respect. She saw how comfortably he stood there, completely relaxed, despite being one of the most talked-about people in the room. Something about his calm presence bothered her, though she couldn't explain why. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but it was a strange discomfort she hadn't felt in a long time. Still, she reminded herself to stay composed. Tonight was important for her husband's company, and she needed to look supportive and graceful. But the small spark of irritation remained quietly tucked in the back of her mind. As the gala continued, the organizers finally invited everyone to move toward the main hall for the opening remarks. While guests took their seats, Daniel and Richard exchanged a polite handshake across the room. It was brief but warm. Both men respected each other, and both understood that tonight could be the start of something huge. But Victoria watched them from a short distance, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noticed how naturally people gravitated toward Daniel. She hadn't expected him to command so much attention, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, that simple fact began to shape her mood for the rest of the evening. And without anyone knowing, the night that was supposed to celebrate unity and partnership was already preparing the ground for an unforgettable turning point. One that would rewrite the future of both families and change the entire course of the billion-dollar deal. The main hall slowly filled with guests, each one taking a seat at one of the beautifully decorated tables. Soft music drifted through the air, while servers walked around with trays of appetizers. The atmosphere looked perfect on the outside, but inside the minds of a few people, emotions were beginning to shift in quiet ways that no one could see yet. Daniel sat at a round table near the center, surrounded by a mix of investors, business leaders, and a few international guests who had traveled across the world just to attend the event. Every now and then, someone leaned toward him to ask a question about his company's newest technology, and he answered each one with the same calm, patient energy that people knew him for. His presence had a natural warmth. He didn't speak loudly or try to show off. Yet somehow, people listened to him more closely than they listened to others. It wasn't something he forced. It was simply who he was. At another table, Richard sat beside Victoria, who seemed unusually quiet. She held a polite smile whenever someone greeted her, but her focus kept drifting across the room. Every time she glanced toward Daniel's table, she noticed someone else leaning in to speak with him. Someone else smiling at something he said. Someone else showing admiration. "Richard," she whispered softly, "is he always this popular?" Richard, who was busy discussing a project with another businessman, didn't understand the emotion behind her question. He simply nodded. "Yes, people respect him a lot. He's a good leader. That's why this partnership means so much." Victoria formed a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She had spent years attending events where she was the center of attention. Photographers loved her. Designers wanted her to wear their clothes, Influential people often approached Richard partly because they wanted to be seen with her. She knew this world better than most, and she was used to being noticed first, welcomed with excitement, and admired for her charm and beauty. Tonight felt different. Tonight, the attention was shifting to someone else. And the realization felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Like a new emotion she didn't recognize, she watched as Daniel spoke to a quiet-looking investor who seemed grateful for the conversation. Daniel leaned slightly forward, listening with genuine interest. He didn't interrupt. He didn't act bored. He didn't check his phone or look around the room for someone more important. His focus stayed on the person in front of him. For a moment, Victoria felt something she rarely experienced: uncertainty. She wondered what made Daniel so appealing to others. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the flashiest. He wasn't trying to gather attention. Yet people were drawn to him naturally. She turned toward Richard again. "Are you sure he's the kind of person your company can work with? I mean, he seems very popular." Richard smiled lightly, not sensing her discomfort. "That's exactly why we should work with him. People trust him. Investors trust him. It's a good sign." Victoria didn't respond. She simply nodded and looked away, her eyes following Daniel again without her even realizing it. The lights dimmed slightly as the host stepped onto the small stage to welcome everyone. Guests clapped politely. But even during the speech, Victoria's attention drifted. Her mind kept circling the same thoughts. Why was everyone so drawn to him? Why did he look so relaxed, even with so many important people around? And why did she feel overshadowed in a room where she usually felt like the star? After the opening remarks, people were encouraged to mingle again while dinner preparations were underway. As soon as guests stood up, a small group moved toward Daniel to continue conversations. His table quickly became one of the busiest corners of the room. Victoria watched as if she were watching a slow-moving performance that unsettled her. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself she was imagining everything, but each minute made it harder to ignore. She smoothed the front of her gown and stood up, murmuring something to Richard about stretching her legs. Richard barely noticed. He was already deep into a discussion about the financial structure of the project. He trusted Victoria to enjoy the event without needing him by her side. Victoria walked across the hall with the posture of someone used to admiration. People greeted her politely as she passed, complimenting her dress or offering a warm nod. She smiled, but her mind was still elsewhere. Without meaning to, her steps slowly brought her closer to the area where Daniel was standing. She didn't join the group around him, not yet. She simply stood at a short distance, pretending to examine a piece of artwork on the wall while listening to the conversation nearby. Daniel was explaining something about digital tracking and enhanced communication systems that could change how goods were transported across long distances. But he explained it in simple words, making the complex idea easy to understand. His voice was even, steady, and patient. Each time someone asked a question, he answered thoughtfully instead of rushing through. Victoria noticed how confident yet gentle he seemed. She noticed how people around him smiled frequently, not out of politeness but out of genuine appreciation. She noticed how he didn't try to claim the spotlight, yet somehow it rested on him naturally. A small, unexplainable discomfort stirred inside her again. She didn't know why she felt this way. She wasn't competing with him. She wasn't part of the business deal. She wasn't someone who needed approval from the investors. Yet something about his presence made her feel overshadowed. Perhaps it was because she wasn't used to being in a room where another person shined so brightly without even trying. She took a slow breath and told herself she was being silly. It was just admiration from others. After all, Daniel had earned his success. There was no reason to feel bothered, but her thoughts didn't match her heart. Something about this simple, ordinary admiration frustrated her in a way she couldn't explain. When she finally turned around to return to Richard, she found two women conversing nearby. "I heard he closed 3 major international deals this year," one said, her tone filled with excitement. "And he still seems so grounded," the other added. "No ego, no attitude. It's refreshing." Victoria felt a tiny knot tighten inside her chest. She didn't mean to overhear it. but the words stuck in her mind like small reminders of her own discomfort. When she returned to her table, Richard was still busy. But this time, he noticed her expression. "Are you all right?" he asked casually. "Of course," she replied with a smile that felt too stiff. "Just looking around." He didn't push the question, assuming she was simply adjusting to the event. But if he had looked a little longer, he might have noticed the quiet tension in her eyes. The evening continued smoothly on the surface. Guests moved from group to group, sharing stories and laughter. But underneath all the cheerful conversations, a subtle shift in energy was happening around Victoria. She was not used to standing in the background, not used to feeling unnoticed, and certainly not used to sharing space with someone who didn't even try for attention, yet received it effortlessly. The more she tried to ignore it, the more aware she became of every glance people directed toward Daniel. She tried to distract herself by chatting with a few acquaintances, but her smile felt forced. Every now and then, she found herself glancing across the room again. It wasn't jealousy in the romantic sense. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Something she didn't have a name for. Something that felt like her place in the room had quietly shifted, without her permission. Daniel, unaware of her growing discomfort, continued speaking kindly to anyone who approached him. At one point, he even helped a young entrepreneur who seemed nervous, offering advice and encouragement in a way that made the young man's eyes brighten with confidence. People appreciated him, people respected him, people admired him, and slowly, that admiration became a quiet echo in the room, one that followed Victoria everywhere she went. By the time dinner was served, the shift in her mood had fully settled. She no longer hid the irritation she felt, even though she didn't know exactly where it came from. Her expressions grew tighter, her tone grew shorter, and her smiles became rare. She still didn't realize it, but this small discomfort born from simple attention and admiration was the first step toward a moment that would change everything, a moment she would later wish she had never allowed to happen. Dinner had ended, and the hall slowly shifted into a more relaxed atmosphere. Soft music began to play again, and people moved freely around the room, talking in small groups and enjoying dessert. The lighting became a little warmer, giving everything a soft golden glow. To anyone watching from the outside, the evening looked peaceful and perfectly planned. But inside the mind of one guest, emotions were building in a quiet, complicated way. Victoria no longer felt like the smiling, admired woman she usually was at such events. She had tried to stay calm throughout the evening. She had tried to focus on conversations, laughter, and compliments from other guests. But her attention kept drifting toward Daniel, no matter how much she told herself to stop. Every time she saw him surrounded by people who listened so closely and spoke so warmly to him, something inside her tightened. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't anger, but it was not a pleasant feeling either. It was more like a growing misunderstanding between her expectations and the reality in the room. She had come to the event expecting admiration, attention, and social excitement. Instead, she felt like a quiet observer in a place where she used to shine. At first, she blamed the schedule. Then she blamed her mood. Then she blamed the pressure of the evening. But slowly, without meaning to, she began to blame something else: Daniel's presence. She didn't realize that her thoughts were moving in that direction, but they were. And the more the evening progressed, the more her thoughts circled around him, not with admiration, but with an uncomfortable mix of curiosity and irritation. Meanwhile, Daniel remained unaware of any tension. He wasn't thinking about social dynamics or attention. He was simply enjoying conversations and learning about other people's ideas. If he had known someone in the room felt bothered by his presence, he would have made space or stepped back to make them comfortable. But he had no idea that anything unusual was happening. At one point, a group of guests invited Daniel to walk toward the display area near the back of the hall, where models of the upcoming joint project were set up. He agreed, smiling gently as he followed them. The small group walked together, chatting pleasantly. Victoria noticed the movement immediately, and for reasons she didn't understand, she followed at a distance. Her steps were slow and graceful, as if she were simply exploring the room. But her attention was fixed only on one thing: the growing circle around Daniel near the project display. He stood among them, explaining something about how the technology would work. Even though he spoke softly, people leaned closer to hear him, fascinated by his clarity. His hands moved gently as he described the new system, and his calm confidence made everyone else look just as excited. Victoria watched from a corner, unable to look away. She kept telling herself there was no reason to feel bothered. After all, he was important to the business deal. Of course people wanted to talk to him. Of course people admired his intelligence. These were all normal things, but the quiet discomfort refused to leave her. She held her glass of wine a little too tightly as she watched the group. She didn't want to admit even to herself that she felt left out, or overshadowed, or pushed into the background of an evening she expected to enjoy fully. She didn't want to admit that someone else's calm presence made her feel suddenly small. She took a slow breath and tried to relax. Maybe she just needed a moment of fresh air. Maybe she needed to step away from the bright lights and the noise. But instead of walking toward the exit, her feet carried her closer to the group around Daniel. She didn't join them. She simply stood near enough to hear pieces of the conversation. At that moment, a woman in the group complimented Daniel on his latest achievement. "It's amazing what your company has done in only a few years," she said kindly. Daniel responded modestly, "It's a team effort. I'm lucky to work with people who believe in the mission." Victoria felt her chest tighten again. Someone else added, "Your approach to business is so refreshing. No pressure, no ego." The words echoed in Victoria's mind. She didn't like how much admiration they carried. Admiration that felt strangely personal, even though it had nothing to do with her. She lifted her chin slightly, trying to maintain a dignified expression. But the more compliments she heard, the more her emotions became tangled. A mix of envy, insecurity, and misunderstanding formed inside her, feelings she rarely experienced and didn't know how to handle. Finally, one small moment pushed her over the edge. Someone called Daniel the future face of modern industry. It was a simple compliment, meant to be positive, but to Victoria, it felt like a reminder that she wasn't the most noticed person in the room anymore. She took a slow step forward without realizing it. Her hand tightened on the stem of her wine glass. Her heartbeat felt louder in her ears. She didn't feel angry, just overwhelmed by emotions she didn't understand. One of the women near Daniel noticed Victoria approaching. She smiled politely. "Mrs. Langford, would you like to join us?" This question made Daniel turn slightly, offering Victoria the same respectful smile he gave everyone else. His smile was gentle, kind, completely harmless, but to Victoria, at that moment, it felt like the room's attention shifted even more toward him and away from her. She stepped closer, her emotions tangled in confusion. She had been admired for years, but suddenly she felt invisible. She had been complimented by photographers and socialites, but suddenly it didn't feel like enough. All the quiet insecurity she had been holding inside since the start of the evening rose quickly to the surface. Daniel greeted her politely. "Good evening, Mrs. Langford. I hope you're enjoying the event." His tone was respectful and warm, just like always. Nothing in his voice or expression carried any negativity. But Victoria's heart was full of emotions she couldn't control. Her thoughts moved fast, too fast. She wasn't thinking clearly. She wasn't thinking at all. She only felt the heavy pressure of a room where she no longer felt like the brightest presence. And Daniel, standing calmly among admiring guests, seemed like the source of that pressure, even though he had done nothing wrong. For a moment, Victoria stood there in silence, holding her glass, her expression tight and strained. Then, without planning it, without meaning to cause a scene, without understanding why her emotions took over, she lifted her hand slightly. The wine in her glass tilted, the deep red liquid moved toward the edge, and before she registered what was happening, the wine spilled forward. The glass remained in her hand, but the liquid left it in a swift, smooth motion. It spilled onto Daniel's suit jacket. Gasps filled the air. No one touched anyone. No one shouted. No one argued. It was simply an accidental-looking motion, driven by emotion. A sudden act with no force or harmful intent, just a moment shaped by misunderstanding and overwhelming feelings. The room froze. Daniel looked down at his jacket in quiet surprise. The soft music in the background suddenly felt far away. People stopped moving. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The entire hall fell into an unexpected stillness. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the wine, her face pale. She hadn't meant to do it, not truly. But the moment had already passed. The wine had already fallen, and the silence around her grew heavier by the second. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes. Not with anger, not with frustration, but with gentle confusion. He didn't speak. He didn't react sharply. He simply looked at her with the same calmness he carried throughout the night. His calm reaction made the moment feel even more intense. Victoria felt her chest tighten painfully. She realized what she had done not out of harm, but out of emotion she hadn't understood. And she knew instantly that the evening had changed. The moment would not be forgotten. Not by her, not by Daniel, not by the guests, and certainly not by her husband, who had not yet seen what had happened. The silence that followed the wine incident felt heavier than any sound could have been. It wrapped around the group like a thick cloud, making every movement feel slow and sharp at the same time. For a moment, nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew how to act. It was one of those unexpected moments when the world seems to pause, waiting for someone to break the stillness. Daniel stood quietly, looking down at the red stain spreading across his light-colored suit jacket. He lifted his hand gently, brushing the fabric in a light, almost calm motion, not to clean it because that would be impossible at the moment, but simply to understand what had happened. His face carried no anger, no frustration. Just a calm surprise that seemed to soften the tension instead of making it worse. Around him, the guests exchanged worried glances. Their eyes moved from Daniel to Victoria, then back to Daniel again, trying to make sense of the moment. People respected both families, and no one wanted to jump to conclusions. But the suddenness of the action had left the entire group stunned. Victoria stood frozen, her hand still gripping the stem of her glass. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and regret. She looked as if she had acted before her mind had caught up, and now the reality of her action was settling in her chest like a heavy stone. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She wanted to apologize, but the embarrassment made it hard to breathe, let alone speak. Finally, one soft voice broke the silence. "Oh my," a woman whispered, placing a hand over her mouth. That small reaction was enough to start a chain of murmurs across the hall. "What happened? Was it an accident? Is Daniel okay?" People whispered quietly, careful not to raise their voices too much. The event was elegant, and no one wanted to create drama. But at the same time, they couldn't ignore what had happened. Daniel took a gentle breath before speaking. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice steady and warm. "No harm done." His calm tone eased some of the tension, but it didn't erase the shock. If anything, his composed reaction made everyone even more aware of just how uncomfortable the moment truly was. Just then, Richard approached the group, unaware of what he was walking into. He had been across the room finalizing a discussion with an investor when he noticed the quiet crowd forming near the project display. He walked toward it casually, expecting to hear someone complimenting the designs or asking questions about the upcoming venture. But the second he saw Daniel's stained jacket, his expression changed. He didn't react loudly or dramatically. He simply halted for a brief second, confusion passing through his eyes before concern quickly replaced it. "What happened?" he asked gently, looking from Daniel to Victoria. Victoria felt her throat tighten. Her heart pounded as if the room had suddenly become too warm. She knew she had to say something, but the words tangled inside her mind. She opened her mouth, but only a shaky breath escaped. Before she could gather herself, Daniel stepped in graciously. "It was an accident," he said. "Please don't worry." His words were kind, but Richard wasn't someone who accepted calm explanations easily, not when something threatened an important evening. His mind instantly began calculating the possible interpretations of the situation. The expressions of the guests around them told him everything he needed to know. People were shocked. People had seen it. And people were forming opinions. He turned to Victoria. his voice quiet enough to keep the conversation private, but concerned enough that she felt it deeply. "Are you all right?" She nodded quickly, although her eyes still showed a mixture of regret and confusion. "Yes, I'm fine. I didn't mean to." Her voice cracked softly, not loud enough for the group to hear clearly. Richard placed a hand on her back, trying to steady the moment. His worry wasn't just about her. It was also about the impression being created. He knew how much depended on tonight. Investors were already nervous about the future of the Langford Group. A single misunderstanding could change the tone of the entire partnership. A nearby staff member stepped forward politely. "We can help clean the jacket, sir," she offered. Daniel gave a small smile. "Thank you. I'll take a moment." As he walked toward a quieter area with the staff member, the hall remained unusually quiet. People watched him leave, not because they were judging him, but because his calm reaction surprised them. Many admired the way he handled the situation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show irritation. He simply stayed composed. But that calm reaction created a ripple effect. Investors started whispering among themselves. Not about Daniel's reaction, but about the situation itself. Why did it happen? Is everything all right between the two families? This could be seen the wrong way. In a room full of business minds, silence was often more alarming than noise. Meanwhile, Richard guided Victoria gently toward a side area of the hall. His jaw was tight, not out of anger but out of deep concern. "Victoria," he said quietly, "you need to tell me exactly what happened." She lowered her eyes, her voice trembling. I don't know. It all happened so fast. I didn't plan it. I was just upset and I lost control for a moment." Richard closed his eyes briefly, trying to calm himself. "You know how important tonight is," he said softly. "This partnership is everything right now." "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He wasn't upset at her as a person. He was worried about the consequences. The Langford Group's financial future depended on the partnership with Daniel's company. Losing it would cause a huge drop in investor confidence, something they could not afford. But he pushed the thought aside and took a deep breath. "Let's stay calm," he said. "We'll talk to Daniel. We'll explain everything." As they walked back toward the main area, the atmosphere felt different. Guests were trying their best to act natural. But the earlier silence had created a subtle shift in the room's energy. People were more cautious. Conversations became softer. Some guests observed from a distance, while pretending to look at artwork or displays. When Daniel returned, his jacket still showed the stain, although slightly faded after the staff tried to dab it gently. He looked composed, almost too composed, as if he had fully detached himself from the emotional weight of the moment. Richard approached him immediately. "Daniel," he began, his voice steady but earnest. "I want to sincerely apologize. This was not intentional. I hope you understand." Daniel nodded slowly. "I do," he replied. "These things happen." His polite tone was reassuring. But he seemed quieter than before. Less engaged. More distant. It wasn't anger. It was the kind of thoughtful quiet that made people nervous because it created uncertainty. Victoria, standing slightly behind Richard, finally found her voice. "I'm truly sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Daniel looked at her for a moment kindly, but with a seriousness that made her heart sink. "I understand," he replied gently. "Let's just focus on the rest of the evening." On the surface, it seemed like the situation had been resolved. But the expressions of the guests told a different story. Investors exchanged concerned glances. Board members whispered to one another. International partners watched carefully. They weren't judging anyone personally, they were judging the stability of the environment. A moment this public, no matter how accidental, raised questions. If something so unexpected could happen at a simple gala, what did it say about future interactions? Even though no one said anything out loud, the mood had shifted. Confidence had softened. Trust had loosened. And the partnership, which once felt strong, now felt uncertain. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, thoughtfully watching the room. His company's values were built on professionalism, stability, and respect. Moments like these mattered not because of the wine, but because of the environment it revealed. He didn't feel angry, but he did feel cautious. And in business, caution could easily turn into withdrawal. As the night continued, his polite distance grew clearer. He still smiled. He still spoke gently. But something fundamental had changed in his eyes, a quiet decision forming, one he wasn't ready to speak aloud yet. The partnership, once almost certain, now hung in delicate balance. All because of one emotional moment that no one had expected and no one could erase. Morning arrived quietly, but the world around the Langford family was far from calm. The sun had barely risen when news platforms, business pages, and social media accounts began sharing the same headline. It spread with remarkable speed, as if carried on a strong wind that touched every corner of the business world. People discussed it during breakfast, in offices, and even in long morning commutes. Everywhere, one name kept appearing: Carter Dynamics. And with it, the shocking update that the company had officially withdrawn from a major partnership with the Langford Group. Richard woke earlier than usual, unable to sleep properly after the tense night. He hoped that perhaps things would look different in the morning. Maybe the situation would calm down. Maybe Daniel would reconsider with time. But as he reached for his phone and saw hundreds of unread messages, he knew the opposite had happened. The news had reached everyone, and the fallout he feared had already begun. His company's board members had sent multiple messages requesting an emergency meeting. Some messages were short and strict, while others were long and filled with worry. But all shared one thing: concern about the company's future. Investors who had been supportive for years now hesitated. Several even requested temporary pauses on upcoming projects, saying they needed time to assess the situation. Words like instability, reputation, and financial risk filled the messages, tightening a knot in Richard's stomach. Meanwhile, downstairs, Victoria sat alone at the breakfast table. She had barely touched her food. She looked tired, with her hair loosely tied and her eyes showing a mixture of regret and confusion. The grand home that once felt full of elegance now seemed strangely silent, as though even the walls sensed the unease in the air. She had already seen the headlines. She had read the comments, the questions, the opinions, and the discussions online. Some people wondered how such a respected family could suddenly find themselves in such a difficult situation. Others quietly guessed that something personal must have happened. Victoria had read every comment, and each one reminded her of how quickly one moment could change everything. Richard entered the room and placed his phone on the table. There was no anger in his expression, only a deep sadness. Victoria looked at him, waiting for him to speak, but he simply took a slow breath. He knew that raising his voice would not change anything. The situation was much bigger than emotions. It was about their company's entire future. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded slightly, but his eyes held a heaviness that made Victoria look away. He understood that she regretted her actions, but regret could not bring back a billion-dollar partnership. It could not undo the damage, nor erase how the business world now viewed them. Just a few miles away, in a large glass building filled with energy and movement, Daniel sat in his office. His team had already finalized the formal withdrawal letter. He read it carefully before signing. Each sentence was clear and professional, reflecting the same calm respect he had maintained from the beginning. He believed in conducting business with fairness and dignity, and he expected the same in return. His employees admired him, not only for his intelligence but also for his self-control. They had seen what happened at the gala. They saw how he handled the embarrassment with quiet strength. Their respect for him grew even stronger, and many felt proud to be part of a company led by someone with such character. When Daniel placed his signed letter on the table, one of his top advisors spoke quietly. "This was the right decision," the advisor said. Daniel nodded. "A partnership should be built on trust. When that is lost, the foundation becomes unstable." He did not speak with anger or disappointment. He simply stated the truth, and the room felt balanced again, steady under his calm leadership. Later that morning, the Langford Group held an emergency board meeting. The boardroom, normally a space of confident discussions and ambitious planning, felt heavy. Several members had serious expressions. Some held documents while others stared at the screen displaying the official withdrawal announcement from Carter Dynamics. One board member leaned forward. "This was our most important project. Losing it affects every future plan we had." Another added, "Investors are questioning our stability. The market reaction is already starting." Richard listened quietly. He felt responsible, even though he had not caused the incident. His role as leader meant he carried both the successes and the failures. The board members continued discussing the possible financial impact, the projects that might need to be paused, and the public statements they would have to release. It was a long meeting, and every minute felt heavier than the last. Back at home, Victoria sat with her hands folded. She replayed the moment in her mind again and again, the words she had spoken, the mood in the room, the way people had looked at her in disbelief. She now understood the weight of that single moment, and how deeply it affected the future of everyone involved. She wrote a public apology, but she knew words alone could not repair the trust that had been lost. She wished she could go back and hold herself back from reacting impulsively. But real life did not allow rewinding. It only allowed moving forward. As the day continued, analysts on business channels discussed the situation. Many admired Daniel's professionalism. Some pointed out how gracefully he handled a difficult moment. They described him as someone who stayed calm even when treated unfairly. And that kind of leadership inspired many people watching. Meanwhile, the Langford Group's stocks experienced a noticeable dip, not a collapse, but a clear sign of market concern. Large investors often acted quickly, and rumors spread even faster. Uncertainty was one of the most powerful forces in the financial world, and once it appeared, stability became harder to defend. Richard spent the afternoon in his office, reviewing numbers, emails, and reports. He knew the company would survive, but it would not be easy. They had lost not only a large deal but also a great opportunity to innovate and expand. More than that, their reputation carefully built over decades had been shaken. As for Daniel, he spent the evening in a quieter mood, reflecting on the entire experience. He understood that everyone makes mistakes, and he felt no desire to speak negatively about the Langfords. He simply believed in moving toward partners who shared his company's values and professionalism. Within a week, Daniel's team announced a new collaboration with a different firm, known for its strong ethical standards. The market reacted positively, and people saw it as a sign that Carter Dynamics remained focused, strong, and forward-moving. Investors showed confidence in Daniel's leadership, knowing he handled challenges with clarity and respect. On the other hand, the Langford Group continued working hard to regain trust. They held meetings with partners, answered questions from investors, and released statements promising more transparent leadership. Richard worked long hours, guiding the company through its recovery. At home, Victoria stayed mostly quiet, thinking deeply about how easily success can be shaken by a single moment of poor judgment. She understood now that her actions had affected far more than her own reputation. They had impacted employees, investors, partners, and the entire company her husband had built. It was a heavy realization, but an important one. Time moved forward, as it always does. People learned lessons from the story. Some learned about controlling emotions. Some learned about the importance of respect. Others learned about professional behavior and how quickly trust can be damaged. And in business circles, the story became a quiet reminder shared in meeting rooms and conversations. A calm response can protect a future. A single moment of impulse can change everything. And dignity, even in difficult moments, carries more power than anyone realizes. Daniel continued thriving, his company growing stronger, admired not only for its success but for the character behind it. The Langfords continued rebuilding, step by step, knowing they had learned a meaningful lesson about humility and responsibility. In the end, the story became more than just a lost deal. It became a lesson passed around quietly. A reminder that respect, patience, and professionalism can shape futures far more than a single moment of pride.